Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MERN Stack Crash Course. In this episode, we're going to finally boot up our front end and start with our React code. We'll start by testing out the express routes we made in the previous episode, and then we'll make functions in our front end that allow us to grab data from MongoDB seamlessly. After our last episode, we ended up having a postroutes.js file that contains all the routes we made, which each represent one thing we can do with MongoDB. We can get all posts, get one post, create a post, update a post, and delete a post. Now that we have all these routes established and we've mounted them in our server.js file using app.use, let's look at how these routes actually come into play in our front-end code. To start off, we need to actually launch our front end, which we haven't done yet. So go ahead and open up your terminal first, and let's assure we have our backend server running. So I'm going to cd into our backend folder. Let's just go ahead and start our server up, just what we have in the previous couple of episodes. Once this is up and running, we want to open up a new terminal that we can use to launch the front end without stopping the execution of the backend. To do that in Visual Studio Code, you can click this plus button here, and that'll open up a new instance of the terminal. Next, let's make sure we're looking in our front end folder. We'll say cd front end. And then from here, we can run a simple command to boot up the front end. The command is npm run dev, assuming you use the V installation process that I showed in a second episode. If we go ahead and press enter, it'll boot up the React front end, and it'll generate this link that opens up a page to our React app. So basically, anytime we want to launch the front end from this point onwards, just make sure you're looking in the front end folder, and then you run this npm run dev command. And we can now click this link to open up our web page. If you've created your app with V, this is exactly what it should look like. This is just a template page that came with the creation. When working on the front end stuff, I'll generally split my screen so you can see both the code and the front end at the same time. That way you can see live changes. So I'll just go ahead and open this here, put this on the right. Then let's just drag this a little bit and then close our terminal here, just so we can have both screens showing at the same time. Before we go on, I want to remind you once again that this is not a course for React itself. I have a whole 3-hour course just focused on React that you should watch first if you don't already know React. I'm going to assume you have at least a basic understanding of React as we go through this next part. With that being said, let's go ahead and close these folders here, and let's go ahead and navigate to my front end folder. So this is the front end folder that has all of our front end stuff, where main.jsx is the entry point for the app, and then app.jsx is the page that's actually being rendered, which you're seeing here on the left-hand side. Let's just go ahead and clear out all this boilerplate code here, just so we have an empty page. So I'll just delete this, I'll delete this, and then I'm just going to delete these two imports from up top. What's nice about front-end stuff when compared to back-end stuff is that it'll update live as you save it, especially if you use V. So if I save this file now the page is empty because we've wiped out all the code. Last episode, the first two express routes we made were both get methods. The first one gets all the posts from MongoDB, and the second one just gets a single post from MongoDB based on its ID. Let's start off with these two routes, and let's test them to see if they work in React. If you've messed with data fetching in React before, you know that there's two libraries that are generally most commonly used, and that's fetch and Axios. Fetch and Axios are the two primary ways we can call backend routes from the front end. Fetch is actually built into JavaScript, while Axios requires you to install it as a package because it's an external library. For this purpose, though, I'm going to use Axios because, in my opinion, it's a bit more straightforward and I like it a little more. So go ahead and open back up your terminal. And we're actually going to open up a third terminal so we don't override the front end of the backend that's running. And then I'm just going to cd into our front end. I'm going to say npm install Axios, type just like this. This will install the Axios library, which we will use to access our routes that we made in Express. Before we do anything fancy in React, let's just test our backend routes inside of this app.jsx file. We know that in React, anytime we want to fetch data, we need to use the useEffect hook. Therefore, let's make sure we import it up top here. Because we already have useState being imported from React, we'll just add a comma, and we'll add useEffect as well. First things first, we'll make a piece of state for our API data. By writing, we'll say const, and we'll name it data with the setter function of setData. And then we'll do that by calling the useState function, and we'll make the default value just empty for right now. Next, let's set up the useEffect hook where we're going to fetch our data. So inside of our component function here, but outside of the return, we're going to write useEffect. And then again, with useEffect, we always need two arguments. The first one is a function. We'll do an arrow function. And the second argument is always an array. And we'll just make sure we have an empty dependency array. I have a whole video on how the useEffect hooks works, but just know that when we're doing data fetching, we want to have a useEffect hook with an empty dependency array, because that means it'll run only right when the page first launches, but not on every re-render. And now, just so we can use the async and await keywords, let's define a function inside this useEffect that is asynchronous. So I'll say async function, let's just call it like grab data for right now. make the brackets for it, and then we want to make sure we call it at the end of our use effect here. This is standard methodology for writing a data fetching function. You want to declare an async function inside the use effect and then call it at the very end. Inside this grab data function is where we can now use Axios to retrieve the data from our backend routes. Before we use it, we need to import it into this file. And we can do that by going up top here, and we just need to write import Axios, and it probably won't autofill the first time. So let's say import Axios from Axios, just spelled like this. In our grab data function, where we're going to call Axios, let's make a variable to store that response. And we'll actually just call that response. So let's say const response equals, and here's where we're going to call Axios to fetch the data. Axios has methods that correspond with our typical HTTP methods. We have axios.get, axios.post, axios.put, axios.delete, and so forth. So if, for instance, you want to call a get route with Axios, all we need to do is type axios.get. Inside this axios.get, we want to pass in the route that we specified in our backend. We should keep in mind that when we launched the backend server, we launched in localhost at port 3000. Therefore, if we actually wanted to access the HTTP routes for backend, it would look like a URL like this, http://localhost at port 3000, kind of how I showed you last episode. And again, just to show this in the browser here, I'll copy this link here, paste it in the browser, and this page will be completely empty because that's expected. But if we do /post, something that actually matches one of our routes, you can see it actually will return the data from MongoDB through our backend routes. And again, the reason I'm showing you this is to show you that when you're accessing a backend route from your frontend, like we are here with axios.get, all that our frontend is doing is simply just accessing a URL that has some data in it, like over here on the left-hand side. In this example, localhost 3000/post contains our post from MongoDB, and all we need to do to access it is call axios.get and then pass in that URL, and it'll get the data for us. Before we test and see if it works, let's just do two more quick things. The first thing will be to add the await keyword in front of the axios.get, because these methods do not always occur instantly and could take time, so we want to make sure we have the await keyword. And then all we're going to do right under here is just console log out the response. So console log the response, and let's actually see if it's fetching correctly. Let's go ahead and go back to our front end page. Let's open up the console here, and it looks like it says 404 not found, and that's, oh, I see why. Should probably make this an actual route. So let's add /post to this so we can check the route where we're retrieving all of our posts from MongoDB. So I'll do /post, go ahead and save it, and you can see now we're actually returning an object that has all of our posts in it. If we look in our console here, you can see that this object is basically just the response that we got from Axios. There's a couple of fields here that represent data around the request, but there's only really two fields that I care about right now. First of all, this data field right here is going to contain our actual response that we requested. So this data contains all of our posts from MongoDB. And as you can see, it's an array of objects, just as we would expect. We should also pay attention to this status field right here. Status tells us if the request succeeded or not. A status of 200 tells us that it was successful. There's a whole list of HTTP errors that you can look up, like 404 is a commonly known one, which means not found. There's 400 bad request, and so on. And it's important to check what the status of the request is before we try to do anything. For instance, if we get a 404 error on our route, kind of like we did up here, and then we try to access the data in our React code, that would cause us problems. In light of that, let's actually write an if statement right below where we're capturing our response to make sure that it actually returned correctly. So what we're going to do is, instead of console logging this, let's just say if response.status equals 200, meaning it was successful, then we can set our state. To do that, we can just call setData, which again is the state function made up here. And then we can pass in response.data, because again, if you look at our object here, that is where the data we got back is actually being stored in this data field here, which you can access with response.data. This sets our data state equal to the data we received in our response. Otherwise, if the status is not 200, it likely indicates the request was unsuccessful, therefore we're not going to set our state at all. There's a ton of different ways to handle errors here. This is probably the simplest way that I can think of for right now, just checking the status. There's also things you can do like adding a .catch after this .get here, and then do something like logging the error out and then returning. You can also simulate that same thing by wrapping all of this in a try-catch block. For now, however, we'll stick with this method of just checking the response status. With that being done, if we now go into our JSX down here where we're going to render something on our page, let's just render some code here. We'll say JSON.stringify, and we'll render in the data we got. And again, with React, just make sure if we're going to display an object, we have to use JSON.stringify or else we'll get an error. So I'll go ahead and save this, and voila, you can see all of our MongoDB data is now on our React page. Meaning, in effect, we have essentially successfully connected our front end with our back end. Obviously, we need to add more stuff to make this a fully functioning thing, but we've just shown that the connection is there and it works. So now that we've done that, let's now test all the other routes we've made, like getting a single post or creating a post. Grabbing a single post from MongoDB would be almost the exact same thing, but we would just need to add an ID field to this route here like we specified in our backend routes. If we just go ahead and let's go to MongoDB and let's go to one of these random posts here, and let's just pick a random ID. For right now, we'll just pick this one. So let's go ahead and copy this ID in here. If I can see it, go ahead and copy that. And then let's go back into our code and let's actually paste it in here. We'll do / and then that ID, because that's the format we specified for our backend routes. Now, if we go ahead and just save this code, let's go back to our page, and you can see now we just have one post instead of all the posts, which is great because we've just verified that both of our get methods are working as intended. If we wanted to test the delete method from our backend, it would work the exact same as this get route, except all we need to do is just replace this .get with .delete like this. That's because if we go and look at our post routes, let me go here real quick, look at our post routes, and we go to the delete one, notice the format for grabbing a single post with this /post /ID here is pretty much the exact same as the one as getting a single post minus the actual method that we're calling. And I don't actually want to delete an entry from MongoDB since we only have 3 to test with, but if I were to save this file right now, it would delete a post from MongoDB. Lastly, we've got our create and update routes. I'm only going to show you create because the only difference between create and update is using .post versus .put for the method. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. So normally to create a post, we should have like some text or input fields that users can type in that allow them to enter in whatever they want. For the sake of testing, however, I'm just going to hard code an object into our program just so I can show you. What I'm going to do now to show you this, I'm going to comment out all of this code right here for the use effect because we won't need it to test this route. I'll make some space up here, and I'm going to make just a new function. I'm going to call it create post, just like this. And then what I'm going to do here is down in our JSX, I'm actually going to make a button. So I'll make a button here that will basically just call, whenever it's clicked, it will call this create post method up here. And for our text inside, we'll just say something like create object so we know what the button's doing. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and hard code an object in that has the same exact fields as our objects in Mongo. So in our create post, I'll just say, let's say let post object equals do an object. And remember we have, I think it's 5 fields, right? We can see it here on this screen. We have the first one is title, second one is description, and then we have content, author, and then date created like this. And let me just fill in some random stuff here. I'll say like, I'm just going to fill in some letters here. B, C, D, and then for this one, we'll just do new date to get the current date. Now that we have the object we want to upload to Mongo, that being this object right here, we can now call Axios.post to go ahead and upload it by accessing our backend route. To do that, all we need to do is type Axios.post like this. And that's again typing the route that we're going to want, which is http:// localhost 3000, because that's where our backend is hosted at. And then we know that if we look in our post routes here, the route to create one is also just /post, as long as we're doing a post route. So we'll do it in here, and we'll say /post, just like this. However, remember that in this route, we also need to pass in the object that we want to create, because in our backend, when we're creating it, we have this field here that we're referencing called request.body. In Axios, to store things in this request.body field, all we need to do is after we pass in the name here for our post method, is write a comma to specify a second argument, and then we can pass in the object that we want to upload, which in our case is just called post object. And again, what passing this argument allows us to do is in our post routes, we can then access this request.body field, which holds all the data we want to post to MongoDB. There's a couple of different ways we can pass data down through an Axios request. However, this is the way I like to typically go about it and what is probably the easiest way. Let's go ahead and test this out. Let's go in our console here. Let's clear it out so we can know if there's any errors. Let's go in here, make sure this is all fine, which I think it is. Go ahead and save it. And you'll see you have a button that says create object. And now let's test it. Let's go ahead and click create object. Let's check our console. We don't have any errors. So let's go ahead and go to Mongo. Let's refresh this page and let's see if it actually uploaded to MongoDB. And we can see we now have a fourth object in here down here at the very bottom that has the exact fields that we specified right here in this hard-coded object. And if you notice, it actually gave it its own object ID because Mongo does that by default when we upload. It's titled A, description B, content C, author D, and date created is the current date and time, which is exactly how we specified it right here. And all of this was made possible because we were able to build a proper front-end connection to our backend using Axios to access the routes that we made in the previous episode. Before we move on to another topic, I want to go over something that I usually do to make it a bit easier to work with these routes in the backend. We could just make an Axios request and a use effect every time we want to access the stuff from the backend, but I find it easier to write my own functions that do the Axios stuff for me so that I'm not having to mess with it every single time. So I'm not having to call an axios.post or axios.get every single time I want to grab something. What I typically do to mimic this is somewhere in the front end folder, I will create, in the source directory, I'll create a file, I'll call it api.js or something along those lines. And then what I'll do in here is write functions that correspond to each one of the routes that we have and each Axios method that we could call. So for example, I'll write a function to get all of our posts. I'll say export async function get posts just like this. And I would do the same for each of our other routes. So let's copy and paste this 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And then we'll have one to get a single post. We'll have one to create a post. We'll have one to update a post. And then we will also have one to delete a post, just like this. Note that for some of these, we're going to need arguments to pass in. For example, get post, update post, and delete post are all going to need IDs, which is the ID of the post in question of whatever we're interacting with. So we can make an ID parameter for each of these. We'll say ID, ID, and ID. And then we know for create post and update post that we're going to need an object that represents whatever we're uploading or updating. So let's just go ahead and make an argument in each of these called post. We'll say post, and the update will separate it by commas, and we'll say post for this one as well. And then what I will do is fill the contents of each of these functions with the logic from Axios. This way, if we want to say, let's grab a single post in our React code, all we need to do is call this get post function and pass in an ID, and it'll handle all the functionality for us without us having to write all the Axios logic each time. I just spent the last few minutes showing you how to use Axios, so I'll run through these functions fairly quickly. First thing, obviously, is making sure we import Axios at the top here, so import Axios from Axios. For our get post method, we can just do what we did before. We'll say const response equals axios.get. We'll actually make sure to add the await here. And then in this file, instead of hard coding a URL into every Axios request, what I would usually do is make a variable that represents your URL. And you can just use that variable in all your requests. Because if you ever deploy your app anywhere besides localhost, we want to avoid having to go in here and manually changing every single URL. So what I'll do in here is I'll just go to the top here, and I'll just say const URL, and I'll just make wherever our backend is hosted on, which is http://localhost at port 3000. And I don't remember if I've shown you this yet, but if you want to access variables inside of strings in JavaScript, you can go ahead and use the backtick character, which is the one right above your tab key on your keyboard. This treats it as a normal string. However, if you add this $ plus curly brackets, you can inject direct JavaScript into the string. So for this post, we'll just pass in the URL first, and then we'll want to write the corresponding backend path for this route, which would just be /post, just like this. When this line actually runs, we have our URL variable set to this URL up here, and then we have /post. So what this line is actually getting is just, what this line is actually getting is just what we're getting before, like this. This is just a cleaner way of writing it where we're storing the URL as a constant variable. If the request was successful, it will have returned a 200 status code. So we'll do what we did before, and we'll say something like if response.status equals 200, then we want to return the data it gave back, which is just stored in response.data. So I'll say return response.data, just like this. And then otherwise, so let's write an else statement, meaning it was something other than 200. Let's just return without actually returning any data. So we'll just return empty. Again, like I said before, there's like a million different ways you can do error handling with data fetching. And there's definitely a more sophisticated way to go about it than doing this. But this is what we're going to do for right now. Because if it's just successful, we'll want to return the data. And if it's not, we'll return nothing. And then in our React code, we'll just quickly check if the return has anything in it. That's what we'll do for our get methods. Now let's move on to this get post function. I'm actually going to copy this and paste it in here because the functionality is almost the exact same. The only difference is going to be the path that we're actually accessing, so we'll need to change this path inside of the get. We're still accessing the same URL, and we're also accessing /post, but remember when we're getting a single post, we need its ID, which we have as a parameter right here. Therefore, after our /post, we can add another slash, and then do another $ curly brackets to inject direct JavaScript, and then we can add ID in here just like this. That way, if our ID is, let's say 12345, this route would essentially be getting HTTP localhost 3000 /post /12345. That's what this path right here is doing. And then we'll go ahead and keep this same code down here because on this get post, it'll just be returning a JSON object that we can use in the front end. And then let's go ahead and work on our, delete post. Let's skip down at the bottom here. Delete post, like I've mentioned a couple of times now, is almost identical to this get post. The only main difference being the method that we're calling. Obviously, if we're deleting something, we'll want to use Axios.delete, not Axios.get. So let's just change this to delete. So when we're deleting, creating, or updating stuff in our database, we don't necessarily need to return anything because we're not actually retrieving any data and giving it back to the front end. However, just so we can check and see the outcome of our methods, let's just erase all this, and I'm just going to return response like this. And the only reason I'm going to return response is that so when we go back to the front end, we can quickly go and check to make sure the status is 200 or see if it's like a 400 for an error to make sure that it actually went through all the way. Otherwise, we know there's a problem. Next, let's work on our create post and update post. So for create post, I'm going to take this same code here, just go ahead and copy it, and let's paste it in here. We know for this create field, we're not going to need the ID. So let's go ahead and just delete the ID off here. And then since we're using a create method, we want to use .post instead of .delete. So we'll say .post. And I'll go ahead and just delete this here so we know we're looking at just /posts. And we also know that whenever we're calling post, we need to pass in the object that we're wanting to create in Mongo. So let's go ahead and in this Axios request here, write a comma to make our second argument, which will be our blog post object, which we're just storing as this post argument right here. So to do that, we can just say comma and then put in post. So basically, whenever we call this create post, we'll want to pass in the object we want to create in Mongo. And then using this function right here, that gets sent to our backend using this post request. When this gets sent to the backend, this post object that we're passing in here gets stored in this field called request.body. So hopefully now it makes sense why when we first created our backend route to actually create something, we access every single one of these fields from request.body. The idea is that this post object in our API file should have the exact same fields as what we're specifying in our backend here. Hence why you can do something like request.body.title, request.body.description, because these fields all match the fields that we mentioned in our backend. We'll just have to be sure that whenever we're actually creating the objects and we're calling this create post, that the fields do match exactly. Otherwise, there's going to be discrepancies in Mongo. Lastly, let's finish with update post, because that's going to look almost identical to create post. But we're just going to use .put instead of .post. So let's go ahead and just take this code here. I'm going to go ahead and copy it. And it's right here. Go ahead and paste it in here. And then we'll know that this update post will require an ID, just like delete post and get post. So this should be like an ID here, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll do that just to show you. And then we know the method should be .put instead of .post since we're updating something, not creating something. And because we'll need the ID back in the route, let's go over here. And just like we did with the get method right here, we'll add the ID to the end of the route. So we'll look at here, we'll say $$ brackets to inject JavaScript, and then we'll pass an ID because that's one of the arguments we're passing in here. And then the rest of this code will remain the same. Now we've completed all the functions in here that we're going to be using for right now. To summarize, remember that we have routes in our backend that all do one specific task, like getting all the posts, creating a post, updating a post, etc. We can use something like Axios to fetch or call these routes essentially, which is exactly what we're doing in this file. We have a function for each particular Axios call, which calls one specific route from the backend. Like this function here calls our get all routes. This function here calls just our get a single route. This function here calls a route to create, and you get the picture. Now, let me show you how we can easily call these functions from the front end. Let's go ahead and navigate back to app.jsx. I'm going to comment out this function for right now because we'll use it in a second. I'm going to uncomment useEffect, comment it, and I said delete all this stuff just so we can start fresh. I'll actually delete this as well. Let's first test the method to get all of our posts from MongoDB. We'll make a function in here. We'll say async function. Let's just call it load all posts or something like this. And then we'll write it like this. Make sure we call it at the end here. And then let's import all the functions from our API file that we just created, just so we can have all of them ready to use. So we'll actually delete this Axios import because we won't need it in this file. Let's say import get post. And let's add comments here. Get post. We have create post, update post, and delete post. So now we have all of these functions now imported in app.jsx. Now, all we need to do in this function here where we're actually loading all our posts is just call the function we just made. So I'll say something like let data equals await get post, just like this. We know that this get post method here is going to return the post if it was successful and nothing otherwise. So let's do a statement here. We'll just say if data, and then we can set some sort of state. So let's make a piece of state up here. Let's call it, instead of data and set data, let's do set post, post, and then we'll do set post. And then we'll just keep the use state empty right here, just so the default value of post is null. Inside this if statement here, meaning our data came back correctly from our function, we can go ahead and set the state. By doing that, we can just say set post data like this. If it didn't come back successful, then for right now, we won't do anything because we would just be setting our post to be empty or null, and it's already empty when it's initialized, so there's not much point in really checking for that. Now, finally, in our JSX, just to show you on the page, like we were doing before, let's just stringify this whole thing. We'll say json.stringify, and we'll pass in our post state. Let's go back to our front end page here before we save it. Let's go ahead and make sure this console's cleared out. And let's go ahead and save this right now. And you'll see we're displaying all of our posts from MongoDB. You can see that we now have a page that contains all of our posts in it, which means we've effectively taken information from MongoDB and gotten it all the way into our React application. Meaning after 5 episodes now, we are now able in React code to call functions from a separate backend server that will then access database information stored anywhere in the world in the cloud. Pretty cool stuff. Just for the sake of testing, let's test our, let's say our create post method from right here. So we've already imported it into our app.jsx file. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this whole use effect here. And then let's, like we were doing before, let's just make a button that is going, to just call this function up here, this create post. So let's say on click, we want to call create post just like this. And we'll say create post just like this. And all we're going to do in this function now is instead of calling axios.post, we'll call the function that we just made, which is, as we can see, create post. And we need to make sure we pass in a post object that we want to upload to Mongo. So we'll just say create post, and we'll pass in the post object we just made. And just so it's slightly different than the one before, let's just change this like Z here, X, Y. This will be just A again, like this. And then we'll go ahead and save this file here. Let's go ahead and click create post. It says there is a maximum call stack size exceeded. Oh, and that's, I think, actually because our create post is the same name as this function here. So let's just call this one like make post or something, just so it's not redundant. Let's clear this out here. I think that should be the error. Let's save it again, click it, and let's see, we have another error here. Oh, and that's actually because I forgot to change the name here. And just to make post, and let's finally test it and see if this one works. Let's save this file, click create post. Hopefully, okay, there's no errors this time. That's a good thing. Let's go into Mongo. Let's go ahead and save it. And let's see if it created a post. You can see it says out of 5. And down here at the very bottom, you can see it just created a new post, just like we specified right up here. So hopefully now you have a good idea of why I wrote these separate functions like create post or just get post, because I think it actually makes it a lot more convenient if you have those functions in their own separate file, because these contain all the Axios logic. So that way we're not having to write, axios.get, axios.post all in our React code. It'll just be in a separate function. And all we need to do to call it is just import that function, and then it can do whatever functionality we want it to do. There are a lot of moving parts to where we've gotten so far in this series. So let me do a very quick review before we end this episode of everything we have done so far and how it has led us to this point. So first, as you know, we set up our MongoDB database and our collection that we called post so we can store data. We named the database itself blog data, and then the collection is just named posts. Each item in this collection will represent one blog post object. Then we started with our backend folder, and we mess with these connect.js files and the server.js file. And what these do is basically handle all of our backend functionality by connecting to MongoDB and then running and spinning our server. And then what we did last episode is make this post routes file here, where we make one route for each specific task that we want to do. So we can go ahead and get all the posts from Mongo, we can create something in Mongo, delete something from Mongo, and so forth. In our front end, we have this file called api.js. And in this file, we have functions that can interact with these routes and our post routes by using a fetching library like Axios. And these are all one-to-one. So for each function in here, there is a corresponding route in our backend. So again, post route is in our backend, API is in our front end, and how we're connecting the two of them is by using these routes. Then in our React code, which is be something like app.jsx, we can then import these functions we made that will interact with our backend, and then we can call them as we please to do things like creating an object from our React page or just getting all the objects and displaying them on our React page. If there's something you're not confident on or you're still confused about the way this is all set up, feel free to rewind any of these videos or otherwise leave a comment and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can to help you out. Now that we've got all the foundations of our app built, in our next video we will use React to truly start building out the web app. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.